'Tis the time of the season to dress up in a costume that shows off your body, to eat candy that you're supposed to distribute to children, and play scary games that really aren't all that scary. Now, I can't think of a scarier game than Castlevania III, Dracula's Curse. Now, you may be wondering, how is an 8-bit prequel from 1989 scarier than, say, Outlast or something? Well, as terrifying as predictable jump scares are, what I find truly mortifying is that a game from 1989 handles its opening level far better than 95% of today's games. I should probably back that claim with some facts. So, without any further hesitation, let's delve into why Castlevania III's opening level is oh so fine. The game begins in an area bereft of any enemies. In a platforming game, where controlling your character's movement is of the utmost importance, giving the player a safe area to become acquainted with the game's control scheme is a great way to start off the game. This may seem obvious, but you'd be surprised how some developers screwed this up. An important piece of terrain here is the stairwell, which is something the player will be interacting with constantly throughout the level. Once again, nice that the player becomes accustomed to using the stairs before any combative engagements. Frustrations with the controls are effectively mitigated when the player is given this small, simple area to romp around in. In this room resides the game's first enemies. Common logic deems that the first enemy be the easiest, and Castlevania III doesn't disobey that tenet. No challenge, but the player now has a grasp on how to properly attack an enemy. Unlike the previous area, mandatory usage of the stairwell is required to progress, which is smart since a litany of stairs are about to be part of the challenge of the next section. Here, the player learns two things: how to fight on stairs, and how to combat flying enemies. Making the player's initial interaction with stairs tranquil was definitely the way to go, since now they've been eased into stairwell combat rather than having it all thrown onto them at once. The bats here are also a brilliant introduction to flying enemies. Their slightly irregular oblique attack movement isn't too difficult that they can't be dispatched with a simple whip, but the player still learns how to anticipate enemies at different initial elevations. You may notice I gained another consumable sub-weapon here. All but one sub-weapon is present in this level, which is good. It ensures the player will become familiar with all the sub-weapons, which are pretty important in this game. As you saw, the moment Ralph enters up the stairwell here, he's immediately assaulted by a descending skeleton. This is the first true vertical challenge for the player, necessitating them to predict the gaps between the falling enemy and the projectile. This type of scenario is going to be a chronic occurrence, so it's rather dandy that neither the skeleton nor the bone particularly deal much damage. This part reminds the player of the general life teaching, think before you do, since biting the bait results in this happening. I'm glad teaching the player not to take leaps of faith was taught in level 1 rather than saved for some trick in later levels. Now if the player dies to a risky jump, the onus is on them for putting themselves in such a predicament in the first place. The subsequent section starts off by placing one of its two hazards in a non-threatening environment right at the beginning. Jumping onto the blue panel ejects Ralph beneath it, but below the first panel is the pathway he's already going to. Now that the player is aware of the hazard that is the blue panels, the next threat is introduced, the Medusa heads. I like how the Medusa heads start spawning in before the player is running along the upcoming blue panels, giving them ample time to evaluate the new enemy. The parabolic arc the Medusa heads fly in, combined with them coming from both sides while the player is stuck on the blue panels, creates the first real challenge for the player. However, since this is the first level, the player is given a second chance in the form of the floor below, preventing them from instantly dying upon their first mistake. In later levels, such safety net won't be present, but since this is the first level, it's nice to have a soft plot of bricks to catch your fall. I want to take a moment here to commend the overall design of the game thus far. Every room has gradually increased the challenge, with every area introducing something new. Castlevania III has done all of this without being overly bombastic, restraining itself to only one or two new concepts at a time. It's engaging and challenging without being overbearing. I digress. The next section is kind of After dealing with the Medusa heads in the previous room, it seems strange to make this room so easy. There's one mildly dangerous jump, and the new enemies are a cakewalk to kill. The zombies in this room don't do anything special other than attack from both sides, but that's a tactic the far more dangerous and terrifying Medusa heads were already implementing in the previous room. The enemies here flank the player far more frequently than the Medusa heads, but I don't believe this already familiar concept justifies an entire room to itself. I suppose one could defend this room as preparing the player for a sequential room, where the zombies attack together with bats. However, I find that to be a tenuous defense when all this bland room does is introduce a single, easy enemy type. Thankfully, the next room is far more interesting. The gremlins here are one of the quickest, most aggressive enemies in the game, and if they close the distance, can dish out a fair bit of damage. As long as the player stands their ground and waits for the gremlins to approach Ralph, they'll be fine. The problem arises if the player tries to push past the considerably faster gremlins. The player is taught to keep a cool head here, and not to brute force through enemies, which will cause the player to aggro multiple gremlins at once. This section concludes by giving the player an enemy whose projectile attack is negated by the whip, which informs the player that their own attacks counter enemy projectiles. Such knowledge may have already been garnered from the blue skeletons earlier, but here the straight direct attack from the bone pillars makes whipping the hostile projectiles far easier. Finally, the game presents us with the last stretch of level that leads into the boss room. The obstacles of this room are probably what should have been present 2 rooms ago. Here the player has the easy zombie and bat enemies to combat, but unlike previous rooms, the player is fighting them at the same time. Now the player is dealing with a grounded enemy and a flying enemy simultaneously, showing them how to fight multiple enemies at different elevations. It's not particularly challenging, but it's best to teach this concept with 2 of the easiest enemies in the game, rather than something like a Medusa head and a tanky knight later on. I like how Ralph just strolls into the boss room here, not much indication that this was going to be the boss arena until the camera stops scrolling. Even though the player might be petrified by Skull Knight's sudden appearance, he's pretty elementary to deal with, as the bosses of most first levels are. Skull Knight keeps the instructional facet of this level going strong, as he teaches the player to use terrain to their advantage in a boss fight, which is a crucial strategy in many of the boss fights throughout the game. That being said, Skull Knight probably should have taken more than one evasive move to defeat him, but the lesson is learned nonetheless. Let's summarize everything the player knows after this level, which for a first playthrough takes not even 10 minutes. The player can comfortably control Belmondo, has a good grasp on how to fight on stairs, can counter both flying enemies and projectile attacks, knows how about all the sub-weapons work, has been taught to keep a calm head at all times and not react manically to stressful situations, and, most importantly, recognizes that they should look for potential hazards from the terrain, not just from enemies. This is a great level, and the takeaway I want people to gain from this is, the game taught all this about itself without directly telling the player what to do. The game kept establishing fresh and slightly more demanding challenges, and left it in the hands of the player to figure it out. Now, Castlevania III isn't a particularly deep game, at least when looking at the narrative or controls, but it amazes me how so many games today can take hours before they teach the player how to be at least mildly competent at the core gameplay. Developers don't need to design so much hand-holding for simple games, as proved when an 8-bit game that is nearly 30 years old accomplishes what so many games nowadays, that use slow voice tutorials, can't do in just 10 minutes. 5 console generations later, and somehow tutorials have become less efficient yet more obtrusive. If Castlevania III looked interesting to you, it's a pretty easy game to find. It's available for the NES, it can be bought on the Nintendo Virtual Shop, and, if you're smart, you can play it for free with a simple Google search. Now, I'm not advocating emulating a 30-year-old 8-bit game, as that would deprive Nintendo of millions of dollars, but I am stating that Castlevania III is not in the mini NES library, is completely overpriced at all outlets selling it, and is far more convenient to record when played on a computer. Whatever you do, I hope you enjoy the game as much as I did. I also hope you enjoyed this video, which was supposed to be released on Halloween, but I was busy and didn't want the video to suck, except I wasn't busy and the video still sucks. I hope you all had a wonderful Halloween, and I hope to see you for the next one.